Hey, it's Grayson. This is the Fixer Punk podcast. This is the podcast where we go into everything from fixing problems in society to fixing problems in people's everyday lives and fixing even my own life sometimes. Today I want to get a little bit more into news, into a topic that's in the news but still very practical, very much in line with trying to solve problems and help people, and a little bit of some of the stories that I've been hearing about one particular issue that's going to become a really, really big issue soon, and that is the eviction moratoriums, and also I'm going to get a little bit into the whole concept of labor shortage. But first, the eviction moratoriums, which there's been a lot of headlines nationwide with the CDC moratorium being still being in place, but with but basically just on a stay of enforcement of a court order striking it down. And eviction moratoriums are starting to expire nationwide. Here in California, where I am, going to expire June 30th. A lot of potential fallout coming from that. Unfortunately, there's sort of this mythology around these eviction moratoriums and struggling landlords. I've been getting a lot of that discourse, a lot of people getting very angry saying those people just need to pay up. They just need to pay the money for what they're renting and don't have government give it to you. The government's taking landlords' properties and unfairly burdening landlords. Who's caring about the landlords and making sure that they're doing well financially? That the landlords are suffering. Why should they have to work so hard for these freeloaders, these moochers? But really, except for maybe a few very minor cases, I don't think that this is really an issue. And besides, there are still evictions going on. There are actually still evictions going on right now. Right now, there are cases pending that the moratoriums aren't stopping. And moratorium doesn't mean that you don't have to pay, which if you're somebody who, one of those rare exceptions of people that just decided I'm not going to pay whatsoever even though I have the money, I would not recommend you do that. I'm a licensed real estate agent, and doing that and getting yourself in a situation where you're going to ultimately get sued, have a judgment against you, that'll harm you a lot in the future. If you want to go buy a house in the future, save up money for that. The whole idea of having a judgment against you, having possible credit damage from that, which the moratoriums don't protect against. If you have the money and it's not going to present a hardship for you, moratorium or not, I do think that it's typically actually in the person's best interest, in the tenant's best interest to pay. And there are still many incentives and systems in place to ensure that people are paying. So it's a very rare exception, but you see it's oversized, it's outsized. In YouTube comment sections, I posted this on the Instagram at FixerPunk, about landlords getting upset that they're not getting their rent checks, and people in the public who are scared exploited workers who feel like they have to say, well, no, you need these poor moochers need to pay the landlords, and the landlords are suffering. And there's also sort of an issue with like magnitudes of suffering, because somebody who's lost their job, who needs this protection, who isn't getting paid, and the intention is basically so that when you do start to pay, then you can pay it back. When you do start to get paid from unemployment, when you get benefits, that you can pay it back if it's something that's not going to present a serious hardship to you. That's what these moratoriums are really for, and what they accomplish. Because it doesn't waive rent, it's not rent forgiveness, or there is the rental relief, which that rent relief is going to go a long way for a lot of people, and that'll cover a good deal of the debts. But that's what it's for, because there have been delays in unemployment payments, delays in stimulus checks, delays in small business relief, things like that, and that's what they're supposed to help with, and it's done a good job in that regard. Now, I'll say that I do believe that landlords should have gotten eligibility for unemployment if that was basically their job. And it's not really, I know it's not really a job, but you can sort of classify it as a small business and put it under the pandemic unemployment assistance. I don't know why that wasn't done, because that would create more bipartisanship, more solidarity, more unity around unemployment, instead of the wealthier people saying unemployment's bad because we can't get low-wage workers at McDonald's. So if you're helping a larger set of more privileged people, and these privileged people tend to hang out with each other, and you happen to have your buddy with rental property who got their income replaced by the pandemic unemployment assistance, you're going to think very favorably of that program, even if it's causing a little bit of a rub in your daily McDonald's run. And you happen to have kept your own job within that sort of like upper middle class strata, as just a strategic move that I would have done. And yes, I totally get the whole idea of slumlords and bad landlords, and the abuses of having a private housing system without a good public housing system, having private exploitative practices. And that's why I strongly advocate for publicly owned housing, cooperatively owned housing as different alternatives to the conventional system of landlords, especially the so-called slumlords that violate the ethical standards that you're supposed to hold in the real estate profession. Because a landlord can own a ton of properties and not have to deal with tons and tons of tenants and not have to hold a real estate license. So they're not really being held accountable in the ways that they should. And tenants are often not represented by an agent. So that's sort of the big overview of this whole supposed problem and all this rigmarole of people getting pissed off in YouTube comment sections about landlords not getting what they're owed. And I did mention in the post on the Instagram at FixerPunk that there is economic injury disaster loans, which are loans that will tide landlords over until the tenants are able to pay, because that's the intention, or the rent relief programs come into effect and the rent relief programs pay off that back due debt. And people are saying, why would they have to take out a loan? Well, you're in the freaking rental property business. You're always going to be taking out loans. You're always going to be dealing with debt to some extent, especially in economic downturns. It's just the nature of being in that kind of business. And that's assistance that's out there. The EIDL, Economic Injury Disaster Loan, is available. And that might calm down. And I feel bad for anybody who's disabled, retired, whatever, and they need that income. I think everybody should be taken care of, whether they're a tenant, low income worker, or somebody who is disabled, or just simply too old to be in the workforce. I think they should all be taken care of fully. And that's where I want to aim public policy. But one thing, speaking of elderly and disabled, that has been really getting under my skin, and unfortunately I know somebody that is in this situation, is there are evictions still going on right now. There are evictions that are still happening to people, and people in the most vulnerable situations possible. We're talking about seniors being evicted from senior living facilities, and it's still happening. So someone that I kind of know has told me about a situation that's going on where a senior living facility in California, which has pretty strong eviction moratoriums, is evicting somebody who desperately needs housing and doesn't really have anywhere else to go. And the moratorium doesn't block it. The moratorium should be blocking it, really. In this case, the moratorium should be blocking it. It legally should be blocking it, because this person says they complied with the requirements, which there's a requirement to submit a declaration of financial distress to qualify for the moratorium. So it's not automatic. But the landlord can go and claim, even if you did submit it, they can go and file. They can still file an eviction lawsuit, and they can say, "Well, we never got within the notice period. We never got a declaration," and then that winds up going to a court hearing. And this whole process, to me, especially in the context of senior living, is kind of, actually, it is very inhumane, even outside of any time you're dealing with somebody who would become homeless, but just especially so in the context of seniors with health issues, the idea of evicting them during the moratorium period whatsoever. I just feel like that's inherently unethical and very blatantly unethical. Not that it's ethical to evict people during the moratorium who are not in those types of circumstances. It isn't. But just those set of circumstances. And I feel like, honestly, it shows sort of the cruelty of the court system and the legal system, how the proceedings happen, because you have somebody who's old, who doesn't really understand how to use video conferences, and everything has to be done by video. Now the courts have gone virtual, which has benefits, but you have somebody who's in a facility, has some difficulties moving around because of their age and because of their health. And the court basically, for these cases, and this is with a declaration submitted, the court wants to know, because they want to figure out, landlord says you didn't submit it, you say you submitted it, you submitted one with the case, which that's what you do when you claim a COVID-related defense in an unlawful detainer case in California. So the court wants to know what's going on there. So the court winds up holding a hearing, and just dragging a person into a hearing can be difficult enough if you have somebody who's that age. And the courts are even, in this particular person's case, the courts are even declining to allow an appearance by phone. They keep insisting on video or come to the courthouse and be put on video. And mind you, this is somebody who unfortunately recently suffered a fall and was in the hospital. And the courts are still like, we'll give you a week, but you have to come in or you have to find a way to be on video. And worse yet, because the facility is evicting, the senior living facility, the senior living facility won't even help this person log on to the video conference. The courts should be allowing phone appearances. The courts in California have allowed phone appearances for like the last 15, 20 years for routine stuff like this, not trials, but routine, like minor hearings like this. But they're denying it. They're saying, no, do it over video. And it's been difficult for this person to try and make arrangements for that type of hearing. And I feel like just even for evictions in general, but especially in this case, there needs to be more of a collaborative approach to these types of cases. So it shouldn't be like a matter of having somebody in a court hearing with a bunch of very rigid rules. And I have pre-law education. People with legal education tend to be extremely rigid people, even when they're trying to be nice. With a bunch of these rigid rules, especially in this type of case, they should be sending, and I know some jurisdictions do this on the day when the sheriff actually moves the person out, but they should send like months ahead. They should send some sort of social worker, some kind of homeless services or outreach worker to the person's unit and talk to them and try to find them placements ahead of time, ahead of the actual date of the eviction, find out what's going on, and offer it. Of course, with no obligation to respond to the person, but you want to do this in a manner where it's cooperative, where like in this case, you have a senior living facility that may be costly, that may be a wrong fit for this person. There should be some assistance in finding something that's better, that works better for that person, rather than going into a court proceeding where all you're having to do is talk about complicated legal language that only lawyers understand, and somebody who's old and dealing with health issues trying to defend themselves because they don't have the money. And Legal Aid Society tries their best to help, but they're too stretched thin to go in and represent everybody, even the most vulnerable. So I just feel like, obviously there are going to be many actors in this whole senior living space. There are a lot of unethical people in that industry, but one step, facilities want to be ethical, first thing is there should be more co-op type facilities, nonprofit facilities, facilities where you have more mutual aid attitude toward supporting each other. But then in the interim, we want to have a system where they're focusing on trying to help the health and the welfare of the person who is in this sort of hardship and getting them to the right help that they need. And that's a win-win for me. That's a win-win for everybody, because then that person goes somewhere else that may be better for them, better for their situation, possibly with more public funding as opposed to private pay, and getting that process working, getting support in their place to help them with moving out, things like that, as opposed to just spending $400 an hour on attorneys ad infinitum to try to fight over the legal definition of a COVID-19 hardship declaration. There's so much money that's sort of like burned through the legal system in useless, unnecessary, protracted litigation. And for me, I've thought about going to law school, but this kind of stuff just kind of both turns me off and also motivates me. It strangely motivates me. But I don't know which side. Like I change my mind pretty often on whether or not that's even a good idea for me to get involved in. What I do know is that something has to change. Because if you have a system that kind of acts indifferent to somebody in the worst possible hardship, how are they going to treat somebody who's in a quote-unquote lesser hardship, somebody who's a minimum wage worker at McDonald's who can't afford the 5% annual rent increase, because they also had an increase in their healthcare costs, and had an increase in their transportation costs at the same time, and then they wind up winding up in the eviction process and having difficulty finding a place because their credit is being ruined in the process. Which, yes, there are certain protections, but you can still wind up with problems after having an eviction. But this alone, if you look at how the system just is indifferent to really, really bad hardships, that should be enough for somebody to say, well, we need to change something about this. Because in the case of somebody who's elderly and disabled, there are no bootstraps to pick oneself up with. That is a responsibility that needs to be distributed in society to those who can. And people think that it's being handled. People think that there's like this robust safety net, especially people in the upper classes. This is something that I've started to notice, is the people that are in like the middle class, upper middle class, they think, oh yes, if you're poor and in need, welfare will come over. There'll be some social worker who will help you with everything, with setting you up with all the resources you need. You just call social services and it gets it done. That's not remotely what it is. It's like the legal system. It's complicated paperwork, fragmented agencies. One group doesn't talk to the other group. Paperwork takes forever. And if you want to see Karens having an issue, have them deal with any welfare department. If they deal with any welfare department, any welfare process, because there are so many confusing names, acronyms, whatever, their Starbucks coffee problem will seem like absolutely nothing. And really, there's not a lot of because people tend to not talk to people of different classes, there's not a lot of awareness of how difficult some of these things can get and how they're different from what you would think they are. And that's how you get people thinking, okay, nobody wants to work right now because of unemployment benefits, when it's really just, if you were in that situation, if you were the retail worker on the other end of the Karen problem and dealing with a bad boss, you would totally 110% get that that's not a good job. That's not something you'd want to go back to. The pay is not good. The benefits are not good. It's something that needs to get done, and the market is pushing up the value of that labor to what it really should be, but capitalists are just refusing and going and complaining to politicians and complaining to the media and calling people weak and lazy, when in fact people are being wise. I think that the real solution here is to get into these workplaces and unionize them. I think that we need to see a resurgence of unions, even in like the professional sectors, of all the bosses forcing people to go back to the office. And I've heard a little bit of insidious logic about how people are being forced to go back to the office to preserve the commercial real estate market, which that to me makes a little bit of sense, actually. But a lot of it is just this wacky traditionalism that doesn't line up with reality and doesn't follow economics, even though all these people claim that they're these such great economists, everybody, especially on the conservative side. And I have an associate's degree in economics and used to work for the conservatives, so I can tell you this. They think they're so good at economics, but they really aren't. They're blinded by their own biases. So we have a lot of misunderstandings here that need to be cleared up. There's a lot of fixing to do. There's a lot of stuff that, even looking at people's individual situations, you can see right away all these weird flaws and cracks in the system that nobody thought was there, things that you'd just assume in your mind. Oh yes, that's going to be taken care of. It really, really isn't. And that's really sort of the call for a better, more just system overall, and the call to sort of pay attention to these kinds of things and have more flexible forms of assistance. And I hope that eventually this is going to result in things like universal basic income, very reasonable, affordable housing, access to senior care services as part of Medicare, or more wide funding of those types of things. But in this pandemic, we've learned the importance of having easy access to health care, especially, and sick leave, and the sort of systemic effects. These things are very, very complex, and they can affect people in ways that you wouldn't even remotely expect. And you have to look at that. You have to look at the individual. You have to go down to the level of the people. And I'll say this again. You have to go down to the level of the people who are experiencing the problem and ask them what they are experiencing before you design your aid program, before you design your whole system around Zoom conferences. Consider whether the people in those situations are going to be able to access Zoom conferences. And consider whether the way you're providing your assistance is actually going to be timely, whether it's going to get there in time and it's going to actually do the trick. And that comes by talking to people. And I got to talk to this one person, and I get to see these types of issues and seeing how every single last thing is highly delayed, and how the process could be made better by centering the people in the process, not just thinking about all these processes, these nuts and bolts, but thinking about the people. Because you think about the person, where's the person going after they're evicted? What does that do to society? You think about that, and you think about, okay, then what's the potential hardship to the landlord? You think about the people in the situation, and you think about the people and the flow and the process and the path ahead of each of them, and you correct those to get a more just result and a more collaborative result. That's the kind of thinking that we need to have, especially in these types of times. All right. Well, thank you for listening to the Fixer Punk podcast. I hope that informs you and enlightens you on some of the recent debates, gives you a little bit of perspective. You can always reach out to me with your feedback. Email is Grayson, Grayson, Peltier, PELTIER.com. Follow at Grayson Nation, GREYSONNATION on Twitter, at FixerPunk on Instagram and TikTok. Try and keep TikTok updated as well. Thank you so much, and I'll see you on the next episode.